Beloved, as we move into this weekend, we are now 12 weeks removed from Pentecost Sunday, and we began Pentecost with the awareness that we were moving into Pentecost this year, not able to take it for granted and trusting God for a fresh, significant breathing of His Spirit to touch us. And if we just look, apart from the pandemic, of all that's taken place in the last 12 weeks, it has been shattering, earth shattering. And the dynamics that are at play are profoundly challenging in very many ways to our sense of what do I believe, what don't I believe, how do I manage, how do I navigate, how do I move through this with a sense of sanity, with a profound sense of awareness that God is indeed the Lord, with an awareness that the God of hope will fill us with all joy and peace in believing, and with the prayer and the conviction that God can make us adaptively resilient. Interestingly enough, there are so many scriptures that classically, until this season, we have looked at in a very casual, very self-satisfying way. And one of the readings for this week is Paul's words in Romans chapter 12, the first 8 verses. We know these so well. We've heard these in so many contexts. But again, we've heard them divorced from the context we're in right now. So they deserve a fresh hearing and perhaps deserve an understanding of how out with the old and in with the older might play in to what Paul has to say here and what was going on when he wrote these words, not to individuals, but to an entire body of believers in Rome. Now, mind you, we have heard these words that I'm about to read to you as individuals, and we've already talked at length about the challenge of individualism and how it has crept into the church. But Jesus wants us to understand that He built us for relationship and for community. Jesus died for the community, not just for us as individuals. We exist because we exist socially. It is not good for human beings to be alone. And so here's Paul, and we've been looking at Paul the last number of weeks from Romans 8 right on down. And here we are at Romans 12, and he says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to grace given to us, prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassion in cheerfulness. Now, beloved, I want you to think for a moment. Paul is writing to a church in the heart of the very city where the Emperor Caesar not only rules the entire known world, but is worshipped as the Son of God and as the Lord. And it is within that context that we need to hear these words, where Caesar worship and emperor worship and the local government of the day, the empire, was what the world was expecting you to be conformed to. That puts a whole different spin on this passage. And today we live in a world globally where every nation has built their own empire. And now, because of populism, every nation wants to declare their independence from every other nation. And we don't want to see ourselves quite as a global community, but as a bunch of competing empires. And the empire demands that we conform to its standards. Now, I'm not talking about breaking the law. I'm not talking about lawlessness. I'm talking about the things that the empire says, if we're going to live a successful life, if we're going to do things this way, you need to do them according to the way of the empire. And the conflating of the empire with the gospel is idolatry. All sin is idolatry. The root of sin is idolatry. So when Paul says, here's how you are to be spiritual, present your body as a living sacrifice. In other words, you need to see yourselves as sacrificing your life for the sake of the kingdom. You need to see yourself as living martyrs, as those who bear witness to the cruciform life of Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In a world where the empire demands you look and behave like everybody in the empire. And so it's a sobering thought, but it's an essential thought that we need to look at carefully in a world where God has pressed the reset button and said things that you took for granted before this all happened, things that you thought were going to go on forever, things that you thought you had control over. You don't have any control at all. It's an illusion. And all the governors of the world, all the emperors of the world in our contemporary culture are powerless against all those things that go beyond their ability to control. And so being conformed to the world, which is idolatry, isn't an option for us. And so we've got to begin by living the crucified life. All our beginnings and all our endings are at the cross. Our worship is to present our bodies because we are embodied spirits or embodied souls. We are to present our bodies to God the Father in the same way Christ did, as an act of worship. We don't present our bodies to anyone else but to the God who created us for himself and for his glory. And then in that, we're not to be conformed. Because if I am worshiping God, I can't worship God and worship the empire at the same time. The entire book of Revelation is a choice between worshiping Christ or worshiping the empire. And that's why the book of Revelation is fundamentally misread in contemporary culture by people that draw on unfaithful readings that are only a century and a half years old. We need to understand this in light of the way the ancient church understood it. To say Jesus is Lord is to make a radically revolutionary statement that could in that day get you killed. And there was that day when John the Fox's Book of Martyrs said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Well, God doesn't expect all of us to die, but he does expect us to die daily and lay our lives down. Not just for our friends, but for our enemies. Now that's tough stuff. But God says, if you're going to live a life of worship, you either worship me as the only true God, or you have other gods before you. I am the Lord your God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So my mind can't even be renewed if I'm trying to take the best of what empires offer me and conflate it with what God requires of me. So I can't even begin to discern what the will of God is if I'm beginning from a place, well, I'll take the best from over here and the best from over here and the best from over here that are all part of empire living and make it fit within my understanding of the kingdom. Well, then your understanding of the kingdom, if that's the case, and my understanding of the kingdom, if that's the case, have nothing to do with the kingdom Jesus Christ is Lord over and of which he is king. And so discerning what's good and acceptable and perfect, the will of God, cannot happen apart from my mind being brought into a place of submission. And, there's something to be said for bowing down, because physically bowing down brings your heart and your mind into a place of humility. Just using that as an example. But bowing down before the Lord brings your entire being into a place of an awareness that I am bowing down, not before a system of the world's governments and the empires of the world, but I'm bowing down before the Creator and the Sustainer and the Redeemer of all things. And so when Paul says, I appeal to you based on the mercies of God, we need to hear that as he says that to a community that's being profoundly pressured to conform to the image of Caesar and not the image of Christ. How are we being forced in the current culture to be conformed to the empires of this world? How are the empires of this world wanting us to think in a way that's contrary to the cross-shaped life? How are the empires of this world wanting us to behave in relationship to the way the empire says this is what health and well-being looks like, when Christ says this is what it means to be healthy, to be in well-being, and to flourish? Two different standards of values. So the renewing of the mind and the discerning of the will of God are impossible unless I'm living a life of sacrificial witness, that I realize this is costing me something, that the cross is something I have to take up daily, and I have to resist at all points those things that want me to bow down and worship at the throne of empire instead of at the throne of Christ, which, by the way, the throne of Christ and the cross of Christ are the same place. And so Paul says, by the grace given to me, I say among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought. God is exposing arrogance and hubris in the day in which we live. And there's a lot of humbling that's going on that those that need to be humbled don't realize God is humbling them and they're resisting it. I want us as a people to realize that if we're going to be resilient, if we're going to be adaptively resilient, if we're going to walk in high hope, we can't walk in high hope based on false optimism. We can't walk in high hope based on positive thinking. We can only walk in high hope when that hope is rooted and grounded in the gospel, and that hope is rooted and grounded in the Christ who is our hope and who is the horizon of our hope, and who holds before us new creation as the ultimate destination for our journey. And so, beloved, as we consider the reality that Paul goes then on to say that if you really want to see the charismatic gifts operating in your midst, you can't behave like the empire and turn it into a trinket show. You can't behave like the empire and showboat. You've got to live crucified lives, lives that are reflective of what it means to worship Christ and Christ alone, so that the graces, the charismata, the graces, and the energies of the Spirit can be given freely to sustain you and to affirm that you belong to Him. Because it is the testimony, the martyria, the martyrdom of Jesus, both living and dying, that is the spirit of prophecy. I realize that's a sobering word, but I trust that it will cause you to reflect, think, and consider how many ways in your life and mine is this season where the unrest, the pandemic, is inviting us a little closer to the cross and showing us, I took a lot of things for granted, and because of what I've heard in terms of marketing and branding and what could be for my life, based on what the empire tells me, whether it's Hollywood or whether it's the pundits of well-being that are secular. All of it is empire. All of it is empire. Beloved, even politics is empire. Who are we worshiping? Are we worshiping the empire? Are we worshiping the emperor? Or are we worshiping Christ? That's how sobering this really was for the Romans when Paul wrote it. It needs to be equally sobering for us. Sunday's going to be a great day as we take a deeper dive into adaptive resilience. We're going to come to some of the meatiest things we've been talking about in the last number of weeks. You're going to want to take notes. You're going to want to listen. And you want to begin to mix what you hear with faith. And you're going to want to begin to anticipate that the grace gifts, the very realities that we long for as Pentecostals, are ours provided we're presenting ourselves as a living sacrifice. Sunday's going to be a great day, whether we are at home or in the parking lot or in the building. We are coming together as a corporate living sacrifice to both discern Him in the breaking of the bread, to discern Him in one another, and to discern Him in the text. Let's come expecting. I love you.